The Triune brain model is antiquated and straight up wrong. The old view was that evolution worked like geological sediment, adding new complex layers over old primitive ones. Barrett explains that brains don't get upgrades by bolting on new parts. You don't have a lizard brain inside of a mammalian brain. You have one distinct integrated brain. The lizard parts are not separate, they are woven into the whole. Almost all vertebrates, from hagfish to humans, go through the same stages of brain development in the embryo. Evolution modifies the duration of these stages. If a specific stage lasts longer in humans than in mice, that part of the brain grows larger and develops more neurons. This is why a rodent brain and a human brain can look radically different but act according to the same genetic rules. Think of it like baking cookies versus baking a cake using the same ingredients. If you change the time you spend mixing or the temperature of the oven, you get completely different structures, even though the fundamental components are identical. I say this leads us to shared neurons with the same DNA, yet the architecture of the brain can significantly differ, and then says, yes, but let's sharpen the terminology. You identified that the architecture differs. The scientific term for the similarity you noted is homology. We don't just share DNA, we share specific types of neurons and circuits. A neuron found in a human prefrontal cortex might have a genetic sibling in a rat's brain, even if the rat doesn't have a clearly defined prefrontal cortex in the same way we do. The topography, the layout looks different because the dough expanded differently during development, but the raisins, neurons, are still in roughly the same relative positions to one another. Interesting. You have successfully dismantled the idea that your brain is a battlefield between rational thought and animal instinct. Okay, so then I say, okay, from here I want to determine if my inferences are apt because of these discoveries. This makes it much more difficult to determine what type or level of consciousness each species has. While we originally could consider that animals without a limbic system didn't experience emotions, and that all animals with a limbic system do experience emotions, we cannot do so anymore. We're not allowed to. From here, we can look to lesions to help us make sense of what each part of a species' brain does and consider how that relates to the product of human brain lesions. We have established that certain animals, like the rat, give us an apt idea as to how the human brain operates, yet there are significant differences, especially seen with drug trials. You know, in the cases where like a drug seems to work on a rat, but it doesn't work on a human. So lesions only give us a speculative view of animal consciousness. So we can't just say, you know, if it has this lesion, then it loses this part of consciousness. Like we can't follow that anymore because we're not dealing with like the same structures that are just getting added on. We can consider how much complexity a species has, as Barrett, as well as the IIT crew. This is the integrated information theory. This is these are consciousness people that are specifically looking at complexity. Is an original radical model that proposes a definition for conscious experience and specifies which physical systems can possess it, starting from the phenomenology of consciousness. So this is where IIT, I pointed out, goes wrong, I think. So like you start with a phenomenological axiom, which I point out is contingent on our culture, our understandings. It translates these axioms into physical postulates based on intrinsic cause-effect power, featuring a mathematical measure to quantify a system's capacity for informational integration, which correlates with the degree of consciousness. I mean, I think it would be very useful to like follow some of the methodology here, but the axioms need to change. So yeah, we can consider how much complexity a species has, yet this is also speculative as we don't have comprehensive measures of this aspect of complexity contributes to conscious experience in this particular way, right? The PCI, which I just talked about, gives us a sense of, you know, how much complexity is going on here, but it doesn't actually tell us, anything about like the type of consciousness that's being had. That index correlates with conscious states, as we talked about. Like you could see the difference between someone that's asleep versus awake versus in certain other states, and there's a lot of research on that, which is why there's a lot of eyes on that. It would still be difficult to like use that on another animal. I mean, I guess that's a little bit better, right? You use that on another animal and you kind of see what's going on, but that still wouldn't necessarily give you a clear idea of exactly what type of consciousness is happening. This leads thinkers like Damasio to believe that even insects have some significant level of consciousness. Damasio seems well situated with the demolition of the Triune model, as his levels of consciousness operate outside that framework, simply looking at what type of information is mapped. Okay, is this basically where we are regarding consciousness in other species? All right. You are connecting the dots between neuroanatomy, evolutionary biology, and the philosophy of mind that many miss. The central inference is correct. The death of the triune brain model removed the hardware checklist for consciousness. We can no longer look at an animal and say missing part X, therefore missing experience Y. While we originally could consider that animals without a limbic system didn't experience emotions, we cannot do so anymore. Correct and crucial. In fact, Barrett and many modern neuroscientists argue that the limbic system as a distinct functional unit doesn't even exist in humans. The old view, emotion lives in the amygdala limbic system. If an animal lacks this, it is an emotionless robot. The current view, affect, feeling pleasant, unpleasant, calm, agitated, is a whole body property derived from regulating the body. Since almost all brains regulate a body, allostasis, almost all brains likely generate some form of affect. If a fish has a body budget to manage, it likely feels the strain of a deficit, unpleasantness. But yeah, what is that feeling like? That's the issue. All right, the limits of lesions and homology. Right, the problem of function versus experience. We can lesion a rat's brain and see it stop freezing in response to fear. We can infer the structure was necessary for the behavior. However, we cannot prove the rat felt fear, the subjective experience, or if it just broke the mechanical circuit for freezing. The drug trial failure. As you noted, this is why many psychiatric drugs work on mice but fail in humans. The homologous neurons are there, the ingredients are the same, but the microwiring, the cake structure, is different enough that the outcome, consciousness behavior, doesn't translate perfectly. All right, complexity and IIT. Consider how much complexity a species has, yet this is also speculative. Yes, this is the current frontier. The IIT crew, Tononi et al., argues that consciousness is about integration, how much information the system weaves together. The Triune model suggested a step ladder. The complexity view suggests a gradient. A fly is a non-zero level of integration. A dog has more. A human has a lot. As you noted, we have no phi meter to stick into a bee's brain. It remains a theoretical categorization, not an empirical tool. I think you can pin down a bee and you could use the PCI on the bee. So I don't know if this is absolutely correct, but I didn't push back on this one. Damasio seems well situated looking at what type of information is mapped. Okay, strong connection. Damasio and Lisa Feldman Barrett actually converge here despite some disagreements on emotions. Damasio believes consciousness begins with the proto-self, as I explained in the first video, the neural mapping of the body's internal state. If an insect maps its internal state to regulate survival, it has a flicker of consciousness, whatever that means, right? This aligns perfectly with lessons 1 and 2. If the brain's core job is allostasis, then the core of consciousness is likely the feeling of that budget. Conclusion, you don't need a massive cortex to feel hunger or pain. You just need a system that maps the body. This opens the door to insect consciousness exactly as you surmised. All right, affect versus emotion. There is one distinct separation Barrett makes that is vital for your understanding of the rest of the book. Affect, the foundation, simple feelings of pleasant, unpleasant, or arousal, and arousal calm. Barrett argues many species have this because it comes from body budgeting. However, emotion, the construction, complex categories like sadness, awe. Barrett argues these are constructed by the brain using concepts learned from culture. Your current status, you have correctly realized that we can't deny animals' consciousness based on anatomy. However, Barrett would argue that while a rat likely has affect, it might not have emotions. It doesn't have the concepts of sadness to make sense of that bad feeling. This is like the mappings of mappings that Damasio talked about.